Howdy guys, we're back again with another Lee loader video. I'm going to show the use of the 12 gauge Lee loader, and to make it extra vintage we're going to load some paper shells, and we're going to load those using vintage powder and also some really old wads, some old fiber and card wads. So we'll start off opening up the unit here. And we have the instructions, which if you have one of these loaders you should read through the instructions, of course. Some good tips and pointers in there. We'll set those aside. We'll have a look at the charge table which came with this loader. And we're going to duplicate one of the old high velocity field loads here. Now there's a load here for 1 1/4 ounces of shot with paper wads. They tell you to use 40 pounds of wad pressure, and the powder type is Alcan AL-5, which I happen to have an old can of, and it's about time some of it got used up, so we're going to use that powder. And it requires 34 grains of powder. Now, noteworthy with these old instructions is that they do not specify the type of hull used, or the type of primer, or the style of wad, other than to say that it's a paper wad. So basically I believe these loads are for paper shells using fiber wads, and the only distinction they make here as far as those wads is it a card wad over the powder, or is it a plastic over powder wad. So we've got card wads here, so that's what we're going to use. So we've got our data picked out, and we've got our supplies handy here. I've got some lead shot, which by the way, that's pretty good looking stuff. That's actually homemade lead shot. I have a friend who makes his own lead shot, and that is made out of wheel weights, and it's about 7.5 thereabouts. Much better deal than buying the commercial stuff. And of course we've got our plastic faced mallet here. I've got some paper hulls, and I've got myself a homemade loading block. Easy to make one of these little blocks, just a Forstner bit and a drill press. And for hulls I'm going to use these Federal gold medal paper hulls. You can get these at most any trap and skeet establishment. Guys like these shells, they're very soft shooting, low recoil, and they're not really a very long lasting hull. You'll only get 2 or 3 loads out of them. But they're just about the only paper hull that we can get in North America in any quantity. There may be some European hulls that are still paper, but over here this is just about the only choice. So as you can see, I've got the shells all turned upside down in the loading block, and I'll flip them over when I go to charge them with powder. So first step, we've got to take our die body out of the box, and we're going to deprime our hulls. So we'll set a hull on top. So we're going to use our decapper here. So we'll drop the decapper into the shell with it set on top of the die body with the this beveled portion at the top. Give it a bit of a tap. That'll knock out the primer. So we'll continue to do that. We'll decap the rest of these. I'm not really in the mood to load an entire box of shells using this tool because it's fairly slow. I have done it. It makes you appreciate having a multi-stage press like a mech, or even a Lee press, or pretty much any press is a lot faster than using one of these old tools. But these are old-timey, of course, and they fit in a small space, which is an attraction to some people. So there's our primers knocked out. We can just scoot those out of the way. Next thing to do is reprime. Now in the instructions they show repriming as having this rammer in the top of the die body, and then placing a primer on top of that ram, putting your recapping rod inside the shell and tapping it in place in that fashion until it's flush. If you've got a nice clean flat surface like I have here, you don't need to use the top of the die body. This is arborite, so I just set the primer on top of the arborite. Set the shell over that. Oops. Put my decapping rod in there. Set it on top of the primer. And tap it in. This is the only stage of using this tool that makes me nervous, is tapping on primers. I guess I'm not really tapping on the primer, I'm really tapping on the shell. The primer's stationary, but it always makes me a little nervous, any kind of vibration and impact around primers. But if you got a clean surface, there's no particular risk. Just make sure you're wearing your safety glasses. And the priming goes by fairly quickly. Put that back in the box, and I'll put the decapper back in the box. So we've got all our hulls primed. Make sure they're all even with the bottom of the hull. And I set those back in the loading block. Like I said, I like to put them in the loading block upside down until they are charged with powder. So we've got our powder scoop here, and this particular set has the 190 measure, the old style black measure. And that is the proper measure to throw 34 grains of this old AL-5 powder. And this can's nice. It's got a big enough top on it that you can scoop right out of the can. The style of, there's different ways to use these scoops, but probably the most consistent one is to just plunge see if I can get some light on it there. It's just to plunge the scoop into the powder and let the powder fall into the scoop. Raise the scoop up. You can see it's kind of mounted a little bit above the top. Give it a sideways shake until it's flat. And when it's level like that, just put your shell over the top of the scoop and invert it. And then you've got a charge. So I'm just going to repeat that procedure for each of these shells. So it's dip the powder measure, or I guess actually not dip it, but place it down into the powder, let the powder fall into it. Give it a sideways shake till it's leveled off, and then fill your shell up. I would recommend verifying your scoops of powder using a good reloading scale. Make sure that the charges that you are dispensing with your technique meet up with what the data calls for. Because you can vary the amount of powder that these scoops throw considerably by your style. If you force the powder scoop through the powder, you can put a lot more powder in them than they're rated for. So have to be consistent with your technique, and it does, like I said, it does help to check it with a scale to make sure that your technique is giving you what you're called for. Oh, and I just spilled some there. I'll throw that one back in and scoop it again since I spilled some of the powder. That's what happens when you're trying to do this and talk at the same time. Make sure that's empty. Alright, we've got our hulls charged with powder, so I'll set the powder aside and put the scoop back in the box. Alright, the next thing we have to do is put some wads in these. Now, I'm just going to set those to the side for the moment and show you some of the wads I'm going to be using. Old style shotgun shells were loaded with card wads. Here we have an old box of C.I.L. wads. These are Canadian Industries Limited, Montreal. Kind of a brightly colored wad box, probably from the 1960s, early 70s. And these ones are a .135 card wad. That's what you want for an over powder wad. So there's what those look like. These are quite hard, and that's what you want over the top of the powder. You can get modern equivalents of these wads. There's new manufactured wads. Circle Fly, I think, is one. There's Buffalo Arms, I think they sell wads. There's a few different places that sell wads at reasonable prices for this style of loading. They cater a lot to the black powder market, which uses this style of wad as well. So that's a 135 over powder card. And then we've got a couple of other boxes of wads here. Here's a box of 3/8 inch fiber wads, and this is a box of 5/16 fiber wads. So these are much softer than those card wads. They're a very spongy, mild, moderately spongy, and I believe some of these have waxed edges. I don't think these ones do. You can see the different thicknesses there. This is the 5/16, and this is the 3/8. And this is one thing that takes a bit of experimenting. If you don't have data that tells you exactly what thickness of wads to use, you're going to have to vary the thickness of the wads to get the correct height of shot in the shell so you can crimp it properly. So I've done a little bit of experimenting here, and I've discovered that with the 135 card wad and a 3/8 plus a 5/16, I get the right height of wad to get a good crimp with these shells. So basically you have to assemble each of these wad columns as you go. So you're looking at, that's how they're going to go into the shell, with the hard card in the bottom and then the fiber wads on top. Of course, it doesn't matter which of those is on top, it's the same either way. Now with shells like this, I think these are once fired, I would say, or maybe twice fired Federals. You can see the hull is opened up very nice and round, and that makes it easy to put the wads in. You can just basically put them in by hand, kind of shove them past that little bit of resistance there at the front. Kind of shove it in sideways till you get it down in the shell, and then use your rammer here to finish seating it on top of the powder. See, that's down by the powder now. And the fiber wads, you can kind of twist those in place. Just give them a bit of a twisting motion to get them in past the remains of the old crimp. I'll put the other one on top of it there. And then we'll force those into place. Now the instructions kind of recommend using the die body to guide the rammer while you compress the wads. So I don't really find that absolutely excuse me, absolutely necessary. I find you can just use the rammer by itself, but the instructions do basically direct you to put the rammer in the die body and use the whole thing to compress the wads. Now you'll notice if you read old reloading books that there's mention of using a certain amount of wad pressure, and if you want to figure out how much wad pressure you're using, if you get yourself an old bathroom scale, you can read how much force you're pushing down on these wads with to get the correct amount of pressure. I generally just kind of guesstimate it by leaning on it. So you put a fair bit of weight on these, probably up as much as 100 pounds on it. So putting a significant portion of my body weight, because I'm not a real big guy, on that to seat the wad. You can see that that's, maybe we can get some light on that. Anyway, that's seated down, the wad is seated down very firmly against the powder. If you're fortunate enough to have one of these wad guides, which came in one of my other kits, you can use this on top of the shell, and then drop your wads in on top of that, using it to guide the wads into place. And that can be kind of helpful because it prevents tearing the paper. So we'll assemble a wad column here. We got our card wad and our fiber wads. Stack those up, and we'll start those off. I just like to hold on to it by hand. Use my thumb to get it started. And obviously when you're using this wad guide, you can't use the die body. So that's a little bit slicker. If you have one of those, you might as well use it. If you don't have one, it's not absolutely essential. Anyway, I'm going to finish seating all these wads, and then we'll come back and charge them. Alright, I've got all the wads seated. I managed to rip one of the cases in the process. A little bit ham-handed there, so we have a casualty there. That one's going to have to be torn apart. but there's still 4 that are decent, so time to charge them with shot. So we've got our adjustable shot dipper here, and our load data calls for 1¼ ounces of shot. So you can see this snaps back and forth, and the first snap is 1 ounce, next snap is 1 1/8, and the third snap is 1¼ ounces, if we can get the camera to focus on that. There we go. So I've got my shot here, and we'll just fill that up. This is a little less fussy than the powder is, because shot does not really compact the same way that powder does. So I basically just dip it in and knock it off flat with my finger to get an even scoop. And then same idea, we've got our wad already in there. We'll turn the shell over and just dump the shot in. So it's a fairly quick process. Okay, done with that for the moment. You want to look at these shells to see if they're all fairly consistent. And they're okay. I probably compressed the wad in that one a little more. It's not sitting quite as high as the others, but that should be okay. Next step is to crimp the shells. So to start the crimp, if this was a plastic shell, you would likely want to be using a crimp starter, but because this is a paper shell, a crimp starter isn't absolutely necessary. So we'll take the die body and put it over the top of the shell, and then force it shut or force it down. Now I don't know if you can see inside that very well. The light's not the best. I'll push the hull out of there. You can see how that's starting to close the crimp over compared to the ones that haven't been touched yet. So with the crimp started like that, we can then apply the rest of the crimp by putting the rammer on top and pushing down. Now this procedure is something that's kind of trial and error to discover how much force you want to use. It's not the nicest looking crimp going, but you can force the crimp in a little deeper by leaning harder on the tool. Well, that's not a real pretty looking crimp, but it'll keep everything in there. So we'll repeat the process here. Now, if you're not happy with the crimp, if it's not pushed down as far as you'd like it to be, you can always put it back in the tool and lean on it again and see if you can push it in a little deeper. Now, I'm not overly impressed with the crimps I'm getting today. They are rather lopsided, but anyway, they will be functional enough. I'll have that one another go with that one. Getting a good crimp is kind of a trial and error thing to some degree. Anyway, those will have to do. I've made better ones. You'll notice that these provide a rather square-edged crimp. They're not tapered very much. That's not a problem if you're shooting them in a single shot or an over and under or a side-by-side shotgun. If you're using a pump action or an automatic or a bolt action, some of those guns will not feed shells with square edges quite that well. So there's a trick to giving you a radius on these shells. So basically what it amounts to is you take a washer, or in this case I'm using one of the fiber or the hard card wads, and I'm setting the shell on top of that hard card, and then we put the die body over the top of that, and that will basically have the effect of forcing the shell further up into the die, and we can put a radius on it that way. As you can see, we got quite a bit of radius out of that compared to an unaltered shell. And that will make it a little slicker in a pump action or a self-loader. Anyway, I guess that's about it for loading shells with one of these. As you can tell, it's a pretty slow process. But if you're only loading a few shells, if you're only loading a few specialty type shells or slugs or anything of that style, these old tools will do the job. Anyway, thanks for watching, guys. We'll talk to you next time.